Welcome, everyone.
Eh.
Today we're diving deep into a question that has puzzled historians forever.
Yeah.
How close was Russia to collapsing even before World War I?
It's a fascinating debate. Was the war like the final nail in the coffin for the Tsar?
Right,
Or was the empire already on a one-way track to implosion?
right.
To get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at historical accounts, political analyses, even personal diaries.
I was struck by one thing when I was going through all these sources.
What's that?
It's incredible how many different voices we get to hear from.
Oh, yeah.
We've got the Tsar himself, revolutionaries, everyday people just caught in the middle of everything.
It really does feel like you're right there with them, doesn't it?
It does. And those first-hand accounts, I feel like they're key to understanding all the pressure building up
Yeah, absolutely.
in Russia during those years.
Those first-hand perspectives are so valuable.
Right.
So, to really untangle this mess, I think we should probably start with the argument suggesting that Russia was already on the verge of collapse even before 1914.
Makes sense. Where do we even begin? What were the biggest red flags?
Well, you can't talk about pre-revolutionary Russia without talking about the political scene.
True.
And at the center of it all was Tsar Nicholas II,
Oh, okay.
a man who seemed completely overwhelmed by his own crown.
He did not seem up to the task.
There's this one diary entry of his, it's pretty telling. He writes, "I know nothing of the business of ruling."
Woof! Not exactly inspiring coming from the guy in charge of an empire as massive as Russia.
No, not at all. And this lack of confidence, it wasn't just a personal thing. It
Yeah.
actually led to some really disastrous political choices.
Like what?
Well, think about Bloody Sunday back in 1905.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace.
Right.
They just wanted to present a petition to the Tsar.
Makes sense.
But what did they get met with?
Gunfire?
Gunfire from the Tsar's own troops.
I can't even imagine, like, shooting at your own people who are just asking for better conditions.
It was a brutal use of force. It completely eroded whatever trust the public had in the Tsar and the entire system.
Sure, hundreds were killed or wounded that day.
Yeah, it became a symbol of the regime's brutality, and just how disconnected they were from the people they ruled.
It was a major turning point, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely a turning point. And it wasn't the only misstep that fueled that growing discontent.
So what else was there?
Nicholas did try to make some reforms, like with the October Manifesto, which promised an elected parliament called the Duma. But then he quickly kind of undermined those promises with the fundamental laws,
Right.
which just reasserted his own autocratic power. It's like he just couldn't bring himself to share power.
It's like one step forward, two steps back.
Exactly. And it left people feeling disillusioned and frustrated.
So you've got a czar who seems unsure of himself,
Right.
making these major policy blunders that alienate his own people.
Right.
That definitely paints a picture of instability.
Exactly. And then you add in the socioeconomic problems that were simmering beneath the surface,
Yeah.
and things start to look even more precarious.
Okay, so we've got the political instability at the top.
Right.
But what about the everyday lives of Russians? I mean, what were the economic and social conditions like in those years leading up to the war?
Well, just consider this. By 1914, Russia's population had exploded to over 170 million people.
Wow. That's hard to even imagine, that many people. It must put a huge strain on everything.
It absolutely did. Cities were getting overcrowded as
Yeah.
people flocked from the countryside to find work in those new factories.
Yeah, those factories that were popping up everywhere.
But all that rapid industrialization,
Yeah.
which was pushed by guys like Sergei Witt.
With yeah. Wasn't he the one pushing for all that railroad construction and economic modernization?
That's him. And those
Got it.
efforts did have some success,
Sure.
at least in terms of boosting production, especially in heavy industry.
Okay.
But it came at a cost. Well, Witt's focus was mostly on things like railroads and mining.
Right.
He kind of neglected consumer goods.
So even though the economy was growing on paper,
Exactly.
most people weren't really seeing any improvement in their life.
So there was this report from the Moscow Local Council back in 1902.
What did it say?
It described these horrifying conditions that workers were facing in the city.
Like what?
Crumbling housing, rampant disease, a complete lack of basic sanitation. Imagine entire families crammed into tiny apartments,
Oh my gosh.
just barely scraping by on those meager wages. It was Dickensian.
It's crazy to think that all this was happening while Russia was supposedly becoming a major industrial power.
Right, this huge gap between the image and the reality. And for the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population,
Yeah.
things weren't much better.
Right, because even though serfdom was abolished back in 1861,
Right, in 1861.
it didn't really solve the problem of land ownership for them, did it?
It didn't. The emancipation of the serfs gave them freedom in name only.
They were free, but with nothing.
Pretty much. They were still burdened with debt-limited access to land.
So what about Stolypin? Didn't he try to address some of these issues with his reforms?
He did. Stolypin was convinced that creating a class of prosperous landowning peasants would be the key to stabilizing Russia.
Interesting.
So his reforms were all about breaking up that communal land ownership
Okay.
and encouraging more individual enterprise.
Did it work?
Well, they were definitely controversial.
Makes sense.
And then, tragically, he was assassinated in 1911.
Oh, right. I forgot about that. And he famously said that he needed, what was it, like 20 years of peace?
20 years of peace to truly transform Russian agriculture.
And of course, he didn't get them.
Yeah.
So even with those reforms, do you think there was even enough time to actually fix these deep-seated problems?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians are still debating that to this day.
Yeah.
But what is clear is that by 1914, Russia was a society under immense strain.
It really sounds like it.
You had this urban working class becoming more and more radicalized, a peasantry that was struggling to just put food on the table,
Yeah.
and this growing chasm between the rich and the poor.
And all of this is happening while the Tsar is basically fiddling while Rome burns.
It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It really sounds like it. But you mentioned earlier that there are arguments against this idea that Russia was just doomed to collapse.
I did. There are... Let's flip the coin and look at the other side. What were the factors that suggested Russia might have actually been able to pull through?
I'm curious. What were they?
Well, one key point is that even with all its problems, Russia did have some serious economic strengths.
Okay.
Industrialization, while messy and brutal, did lead to real growth in some areas.
Like what?
Russia had these vast natural resources, and its industrial output was growing really rapidly in those years leading up to the war.
So even though most people weren't seeing the benefits,
Right.
the potential for economic power was there.
Exactly. And on the military front.
Yeah. What about that?
Yes.
Because they suffered that pretty humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War.
They did in 1905, but they were able to rebuild their army relatively quickly.
Right.
In 1914, they had the largest standing army in all of Europe.
Wow. I guess that does show some resilience and capacity within the state.
It does. So while the situation was obviously complicated and there were massive challenges,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that Russia wasn't just this helpless giant about to fall apart.
Okay, so we've looked at both sides now.
We have.
On one hand, you've got political instability, widespread unrest, huge economic inequality.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there are signs of economic strength and military recovery. A tough call.
It really is. And that's what makes this period of history so fascinating.
Yeah.
Trying to untangle all these threads and understand how they all fit together.
Right.
To do that, I think we need to dive into some of the specific events and turning points that really shaped those pre-war years.
Yes, let's do that. Because I think there are a few moments that really stand out. We've been talking about the state of Russia before World War I, all the arguments for its collapse and the counterpoints, you know, those glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
But to really understand how complicated it all was,
All right.
I think we need to zero in on some key events. Like 1905
Yeah.
that year was a powder keg.
Absolutely. 1905 was a pivotal year.
Yeah.
A year of just massive upheaval and crisis that really exposed how fragile the Tsarist regime was. And Bloody Sunday, which we talked about earlier,
Right.
that was just the spark that ignited it all.
Right.
It set off this chain reaction of strikes, protests, mutinies all across the country. For a while there, it felt like the whole system was about to implode.
It's amazing the sheer scale of those protests. I mean, you had workers, peasants, students, even soldiers rising up against the government.
It was a true popular uprising, fueled by years of frustration and anger. People wanted political representation, better working conditions, an end to the Tsar's absolute power.
It must have been chaos.
Oh, it was. And there's this one account from a Parisian journalist who was there during Bloody Sunday.
What did he say?
He wrote about how he slipped on a piece of human brain
Oh, my God.
and saw a child whose face, he said, was no longer human.
That's horrific.
It is.
Mhm.
It reminds us that this wasn't just some abstract political debate, you know? This was life or death for the people involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So even though the 1905 revolution was eventually put down,
Right.
It definitely left its mark, didn't it?
It did. It shattered this image of the Tsar as this invincible figure, and
Yeah.
it showed just how powerful a mass movement could be. The anarchist Peter Kropotkin, he wrote at the time that from that day, the name of the Romanov dynasty began to become disgusting among the working men in Russia.
Wow. So even if the revolution didn't get rid of the Tsar,
Right.
it seems like it destroyed any legitimacy or authority he had left.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Even people within the ruling class started to see that things needed to change.
They did.
Count Sergei Witt, the guy who spearheaded Russia's industrialization. He later looked back on 1905 and said that the October Manifesto destroyed the unified front that had made the opposition camp so formidable.
So basically, he was admitting that the Tsar had to give in to those demands for reform
Right.
because the opposition was just too strong to ignore.
Exactly. It shows that even within the government, people were realizing that change was inevitable.
But as we discussed earlier, the Tsar's attempts at reform, they always seem to fall short.
They did. It's like
Yeah.
the classic case of too little too late.
So where does that leave us with our original question? Was Russia truly on the verge of collapse before World War I?
It's impossible to say for sure, but the evidence definitely points to a czarist regime that was deeply unstable, facing huge internal pressures,
Right.
and struggling to hold on to power.
It's almost like the war was the final push.
It's a good way to put it. The war put an enormous strain on a system that was already cracking. It demanded resources, manpower, unity, things the czarist government just couldn't provide.
Yeah.
And then you add in the defeats on the battlefield, the economic hardships at home, the czar's continued failure to lead effectively. It all culminated in the revolutions of 1917.
So in a way, the seeds of Russia's collapse were planted long before the war even started.
Absolutely. And that's the key takeaway from our deep dive today. Revolutions don't just happen out of nowhere. They're the result of years of tension, deep-seated grievances, and a loss of faith in the system.
It's a good reminder that history is complicated.
It is.
It's a web of events, choices, consequences, and even the most powerful empires can crumble when their foundations start to crack.
That's right. We may never know for sure what would have happened if the war hadn't broken out, but one thing is certain: Russia, in 1914, was a nation standing on the edge of a cliff.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dives, but we hope this has inspired you to learn more about this incredible period in Russian history.
And who knows, maybe you'll discover something new, some new angle or perspective that will change how we understand this crucial moment in time.